Morning, Chair. Your meeting is now live.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'll just mute everyone to start with. Welcome to the meeting. Hope this is Partnership for South Hampshire meeting, another meeting being held through the auspices of Microsoft Teams. We've got a lot of people in this meeting. I think we're up to 32 already, and there might be one or two more to join us. If you do wish to speak, please make yourself familiar with the hands up function, because I'm afraid I cannot see everybody. I've got about 9 faces on my screen, so there might be another couple of dozen I can't actually see. So please do use the hands up function and unmute yourself when I call you, so that'll form a queue in the order in which people raised their hands. So we'll move now, and just a reminder, this meeting is being live streamed so the public can see it as well. So the first item on the agenda is apologies for absence and any changes in the joint committee membership. I don't have any apologies from any councillor representatives. I do have a few from chief executive officers who are being deputised for this evening, and appearing on your screen now, I'm hoping that you'll be able to see pretty pictures of all those councillors who are in attendance. So this is just so members of the public can see who is here, councillor wise. So that'll do, I think. We can move on now. And also, in terms of joint committee membership, the New Forest National Park, Oliver Crossway has now left the authority. Patrick Hennigan is representing the Park Authority until a new chairman is elected next month. And we also have a change in representation from Portsmouth City Council, and Councillor Steve Pitt is now the Portsmouth representative, and Councillor Gerald Vernon Jackson is the deputy. So they've swapped roles. Steve, I'm just trying to see whether Steve has joined us yet. I'm not actually seeing him on the list at the moment, but hopefully he will appear before too long. Right, and also on the agenda, Brian Johnson is the LEP representative. Did say Gary Jeffries, but of course he's departed some time ago. So we move now to the minutes of the last meetings. This is item 2, and the minutes of the meeting held on the 7th of July. And I wonder if people could signify, probably easiest to say, does anyone object to these minutes being signed on some fine day? Councillor Grajewski from Hampshire County Council.
Thank you. Yes, now I don't object, but I do have a question. I don't know if you were coming on to matters arising, Chairman, but
I wouldn't have done, but if there's something...
Just at the top of page 5, which is under the nutrient neutrality update, I wondered if you did actually receive a response from Robert Jenrick.
Unfortunately not, but we do have an item on the agenda today, and things seem to be very slow in government, and this predates the pandemic as well. But no, not at the moment. Right, so I'm not seeing any objections to agreeing the minutes, so we now move on to item 3, which is Chairman's announcements. I have just a couple for you. First one, well, in fact, they're both good news. The first of them is to advise that the Bird Aware Partnership, which is our partnership, has pushed, won an award from the Institute of Environmental Managers and Assessors for the best sustainability campaign in the public sector. And the judges did comment that they rated this winning entry highly for its effective planning and strategic vision in protecting local nature reserves, whilst also engaging with policymakers, local government and housing developments. So some very good news there for Bird Aware. So many congratulations to Anna, Harry and her colleagues who were involved with that. And the second announcement I was going to make is that the legal agreements between the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, and this is relating to nutrients, between the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, Fareham Borough Council and the Isle of Wight Council, that agreement has been signed and completed today. So that means that there is now 820 roughly homes worth of nitrates available to Fareham Borough Council to be able to release some of these planning permissions, which in some cases have been hanging around now for 2 or 3 years. They are consents, as I'm sure all our authorities have, where everything else had been settled except the nitrates issue. And that was the only issue preventing release. And now those developments will be able to, subject of course to the developers coming along with their nitrate neutrality certificates, will see those released. And what I would probably say as well is that the template for those legal agreements is of course available to all our friends in other local planning authorities who might be wanting to do something similar in terms of nitrate mitigation. So those are my announcements. Item 4 is declarations of interest. If anybody does have any, please raise your hand and I will call you. I'm not seeing any. Item 5, deputations. We don't have any. So we move to item 6, which is a green print for South Hampshire and the opportunities ahead. And presenting item 6, we have with us this evening Simon Eden, who's leading on the item from the Southern Policy Centre, Alison Barnes from the New Forest National Park, and Natalie Whitman from Eastleigh Borough Council. So I guess if I hand over to Simon, if you'd like to highlight anything necessary in this report, and we can discuss it.
Thank you, Chair. If you don't mind, I'm going to give you a very short PowerPoint presentation. And while I find that, I think Alison wanted to introduce the item.
Okay, Alison.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. Well, it's given what your introduction and your announcements were, Chairman, I think it's very fitting that we are bringing this item to you today to build on some of the work that we've already done as a partnership. Obviously, you've all read the paper, but I think there's also some other things that have happened since the paper came to you to highlight. And the main one really is the bid that went in from the Solent LEP for its CSR for the recovery plan, which very much highlights sort of the leadership that we aspire to within this region on green recovery, and also the cooperation that we already have on some of these issues. So this is not new stuff, it's things that we have discussed between us for a number of years, and the partnerships you see on the screen there have certainly been hosting a number of you in discussions during the C19 crisis. And I could add to that the Hampshire 2050 work that's been going on as well. So what we've done today is simply to draw together a proposal to try and bring all of these thoughts together so that we can truly collaborate on that and show leadership for the region. So without further ado, now the slides are up, I shall hand over to Simon.
Alison, thank you. As Alison says, this is the work of a number of organisations coming together, and it's work that's come out of a number of conversations that have been happening across the patch for some time now. Some seminars that a number of people on this meeting today attended, hosted by the Southern Policy Centre, meetings of Future South, work done by the Hampshire 2050 Commission. And it tries to turn into practical reality this conversation we've been having for some time now about the idea of a green recovery, a different recovery from the COVID crisis we've faced, and seizing this as an opportunity to perhaps do things differently. We all know that there are a whole host of drivers of change, some of which have been around for some time. There's a growing awareness of the environment, the challenges of climate change, the messages that we're getting about a race to zero carbon and how important that is. The stories that have been highlighted in the past week or so about the loss of biodiversity, not just in the UK, but across the planet. And there's a demand for greener that's come from younger generations. And I have to say, probably not just younger generations as well. I know many people I've seen joining this meeting this evening who've been passionate about these issues for some time. What's been really interesting is how, as we've been through the past 6 months of lockdown and pressure on societies and communities, there's an emerging desire to prioritise health and well-being as we seek to recover. And the report has some data on this, a number of polls, reputable polls that are being conducted that suggest people's idea of how they want their future to be shaped has moved, has shifted. We've got our own experience of behaviour change in how we work and home working as opposed to working in the offices, the benefits that has, whether it's on carbon emissions and congestion, or for individuals in terms of the different work-life balance it gives them. And there's a suggestion that society is changing its values. There was a really interesting article in The Economist 3 or 4 months back by Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, who was talking about one of the consequences of lockdown and the change in the global economy being a shift in value for investors, but also for the wider business community. That shift towards prioritising the environment, health and well-being alongside, not above, but alongside the economy. That's translated into this phrase which we see bandied about, a green recovery, and there are some interesting definitions around. One quite good one is from the OECD, which talks about balancing 4 objectives, the idea of environment sitting alongside economy and societal objectives as well. And the phrase we've used in the report, and I won't read it out, but it's important because it shows that this is an integrated approach, a coherent approach to looking at the economy alongside the environment and alongside social improvement. There is a real opportunity for our part of the world to think about this. We can build on local strengths. The phrase world-class environment, world-class economy is one Alison's been using regularly as part of the Green Halo Partnership to try and emphasise the strengths that we have here. And it was interesting, Chair, you announced the recognition of the Bird Aware scheme earlier on, which has been really groundbreaking in terms of what we're doing. There are significant local aspirations we need to respond to. Alison mentioned the 2050 Commission and some of the ideas that came out of a session they held over the summer to build on the work done last year to identify priorities for the community, which cut across economic, environmental and social aspirations. And it's a response to national policy as well. We know that there is legislation on the books, or legislation in Parliament rather, which is looking at a different balance between how the government funds things and funding, putting public money into delivery of public good. There are duties on local councils to improve the local environment. It is very clear, and our colleagues at the LEP have stressed this quite recently and stressed this in some of the meetings I mentioned earlier. Treasury are looking in future to support the idea of clean or green growth. And we heard earlier this week the Prime Minister making a pledge for nature, the idea that we give over more of our land to protecting nature and protecting and perhaps hopefully improving some of our biodiversity. Alison mentioned right at the beginning the submission that the LEP have just made, which a number of councils have already written to support. The idea of nature-based solutions hub to experiment with what we do and build on the good practice there is in our part of the world already. So how can we deliver against these hopes, these aspirations, and how can we build on these opportunities? What the report argues is that we need a consistent approach to how we marshal the good things we're doing across the board, a collaborative approach. There is no shortage of good ideas and initiatives in South Hampshire. It's really a simple matter, as the report says, of ensuring that we work together to design and implement programmes that achieve economic, environmental and social improvements. It's about collaboration to ensure we're doing the right things and we can identify and fill the gaps that there might be in what we're doing. And what we've proposed, and as I say, this reflects a lot of discussion with people across the patch. We propose a framework which allows us to assess policies and judge whether they're working towards delivering a set of shared commitments. That framework starts with some shared principles. They're defining our aspirations for a green recovery. And you'll see we're touching on a diverse range of things in the appendix to the report, from the economy through to sustainable communities and protection of the natural environment. Agreeing those principles is the key to then identifying what they mean in terms of key outcomes and therefore the changes we want to make and how we can best assess that progress against delivering those changes. What that leaves us with is certainly not a new strategy or a plan. As one of your colleagues at the Overview and Scrutiny Committee I spoke to a couple of weeks ago said, what we don't need is another plan to put on the shelf and to gather dust. We're not arguing for that. what we're arguing for is a simple tool by which we can assess what we're doing across the area, across our geography, our shared geography, allow us to identify our shared aspirations, to assess progress towards delivering those, and to provide a template for building partnerships, relationships like the Bird Away scheme, which allow us to make real progress and build on the opportunities I touched on earlier on. What we have in this report is, as I hope we've made clear, it's a starter for 10. We need to work together to shape this, to make sure that those principles are correct, that the outcomes are the right ones, that they genuinely reflect the shared aspirations for South Hampshire, and indeed beyond our geography, to pick up on the good work that's being done beyond the boundaries of the partnership, to include the wider county and some of our neighbouring areas as well. And the recommendations are seeking the approval of the Joint Committee to allow us to work through the Council's officers, but with others as well, to develop this framework and bring members and bring other strategic leaders into the discussion about how we might deliver this. Chair, I'm sure Alison and I will be happy to answer any questions if I get rid of this shared screen. If I can find a way of doing that.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Simon and Alison. Fascinating presentation. Now, if anybody would like to ask any questions or make any comments, please press your hand and I shall call you. 37 people in the meeting, and I don't see anyone. Ah, yes, there we go. First one, Brian Johnson from Solent Lap. Brian. I think you're muted still, Brian.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, that's okay.
Perfect. Really interesting. One of the things I think is interesting, and you talked about a shared ambition, is how do we decide locally or even nationally, and what register do we need to decide, and do we use to decide what green actually means? Now, from the LEP, our job is to have economic regeneration, and we're not elected in the way many of you are as councillors, but obviously we want to do the right thing. And I'm conscious, if I take an example that's not our area, some people perceive that putting a barrage in the Severn for generation electricity is a green movement, and other people perceive it isn't because of the effect it has on birds and migration. So how do we have a framework for what represents green in our area? Because if we're the LEP and we need to put this into our future plans, we need some kind of agreed framework about what assessment is green and what's a common set of shared values. And I wondered, Simon, how you go about creating such a thing.
Interesting question. One of the bits of advice when Alice and I went to the chief executives with the earlier draft of this report was that we shouldn't talk about green recovery. And I can see exactly what they were saying, because the term green tends to act sometimes as a distraction. I think the important thing that we're suggesting with this framework is that we should define what we want to achieve under that heading of green, if you like. And what's really important is those 5 principles. We've talked, for example, about things you will recognise directly from your own plans and strategies to do with a low carbon sustainable economy, but we also talk about sustainable communities and about the natural environment. I think we are defining what counts as green in terms of what matters to our part of the world, and then using the specific, so we define that in terms of principles, and then we define it further in what the specific outcomes might be. So it might be for low carbon economy growth in a particular sector, it might relate to training and skills in that sector, so on and so forth. So I think we avoid the debate about does that or does that not constitute green by saying let's define this in terms of what matters to us. And when we tried pulling this together, the 5 principles we've got there as our starter for 10 are quite unashamedly nicked from the discussions that were had at the 2050 Commission, identifying very similar themes in terms of what mattered to our part of the world. So that's, I think, the way we try and crack that problem. I don't know if Alison wants to add anything to that.
I mean, I think there are already some measures which you've reflected in your plans, Brian. The race to zero is very much an international thing, which is a very business to business thing as well. So this is about being globally competitive by meeting that particular target. We're also looking at balance sheets which are based on things like natural capital, you know, how it supports our health and well-being, how it supports, you know, reduction of pollution, which we're all very familiar with in this committee, etc. And the other aspect of this is that no one part of this can be done by anybody individually. It's very much a partnership across sectors. So the idea is that we present our own balanced scorecard, which I know you'll be familiar with as a businessman, the idea that you move forward the machine on a number of fronts and you calibrate that in as balanced a way as possible. I mean, we have to accept that occasionally there will be things we have to make decisions about in terms of trade-offs. But I think what we're trying to do is to move further towards the win-win situation and be the place where it doesn't have to be a dichotomy, you know, environment versus economy. And in fact, we can actually realise this vision around being world-class in both aspects. So there's a number of things as well in statute coming forward on the Environment Act, it's still a bill, where we are a number of environmental goods are being actually defined in statute. And again, that will give us a guide about which are the right ones and which ones are likely to be supported by policy nationally and also funding packages. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you, Brian, for that question. Patrick Hennigan next from the New Forest National Park.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Alison and Simon, for a great presentation. And it's more a comment than a question, Chairman. But you know, two things really struck me as I was reading through the paper. You know, one comment was around the real opportunity to tackle deeply ingrained environmental, economic, and social challenges, and I think, you know, that's really important. I think the moment is there for the taking. You know, right now, given everything that we face, the challenges that we face, I think, you know, some proactive leadership on these issues would be very well received. Excuse me. The other thing I noticed was, you know, there's a lot being done, and that was mentioned by Simon during his presentation. But you know, it is so important that we don't do things in a piecemeal fashion, and that we do work together. And I just think that PFSH is just ideally placed to provide that leadership that is needed, and to be the catalyst for that collaboration. And you know, I commend the paper and the recommendations. You know, thank you for a great piece of work.
Thank you very much indeed. Next on my list, I have Charlotte Lyons from Environment Agency.
Evening all. It's just an observation, really. I think, well, I know that PFSH have a wealth of environmental evidence already. What I'm
I think we've lost you there, Charlotte. You might want to dip out and come back. And while you're doing that, I'll move on to Michael Wilson from Hammond.
Thank you, Chair. I welcome this as well, and I think it needs to be a combined approach, because I do worry that perhaps if it's not a combined approach, it could be used as an indirect way of perhaps preventing development in some areas and putting more pressure on others. So I just raise that as an issue. But I do wonder whether we should be together lobbying our MPs for this green print to be included as perhaps a requirement for future local plans, something reasonably prescriptive in there to make sure that we take all these factors into account.
Chair, can I offer a comment on that, if I may? And having spent many years in councils, I'm terribly nervous about prescriptions from the centre on what we put in local plans. I think the point that was made earlier by Patrick Hennigan, it's important that we collaborate, and we collaborate as a series of willing partners on it. You will have noticed the paragraph in the report about how we need to make sure this links to the item I think you've got later on your agenda about the Statement of Common Purpose. I think articulating shared ambitions in that is the right way forward, and then reflecting it in local plans. But I was always very nervous with my planners over many years of them seeking guidance from government. Let's do it our way, please. I think is often better.
If I may, Chairman, I mean, just comment on the, there's environment in one place and not another sort of, danger, if we want to call it that. I think this is very much a way of overcoming that, because we would want the framework to be able to be expressed across our area in a joined up way, and that I think having it would mitigate that risk quite, more effectively perhaps than we're able to do so today. So my hope is that you would have all the benefits of a green society, whether you live in the middle of one of our cities or in the middle of the New Forest. And that is actually a part of the quality that we offer as an area.
Thank you. I move back to Charlotte now from the Environment Agency. I see you're back with us. If you can unmute and carry on your question. Is that going to happen? Yes. Charlotte, do you want to unmute and try your question again?
Oh yes, sorry about that. Oh, is it gone again? No, it hasn't. Okay. What was I saying? I'm just conscious that in order to know what we want to achieve, we have to understand what we already have, especially when we're talking about the natural environment. And I would really like to see some sort of state of the environment for the region. I know various local authorities are doing individual pieces and push the PFSH have got their green infrastructure strategy, but I do think there is a need to understand what we already have.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that comment. I'm sure they'll be taken on by our coordinator and noted for looking at in future. I don't see anybody else with hands up, so I'd like to thank both Simon and Alison very much indeed for your presentation, and very, very thought-provoking. I'm sure there's more work to do there and more for us to be able to use from that initiative as well. So we move on now to item 7, which is the Bush Coordinators report, and I'll ask Paddy to take care of that for us.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a reminder that the Push Coordinators report covers issues that don't warrant a report in their own right. Part A is items for decision and Part B is items for information. In this report, the Part A relates to bird aware and a proposed new financial protocol in terms of the use of reserves. Just as a reminder, income is derived for bird aware from developer contributions. And what the protocol allows for is in very rare situations where developer contributions are struggling to be brought in on a sort of ongoing significant period of time and costs still need to be covered, that we could use the in perpetuity fund to help cover some of the core costs for bird aware. Just as to say, we're not at this situation at the moment, but clearly there have been we've had the nitrates issue over the last couple of years, COVID over the last 6 months or so, and potentially a recession to follow, which could last a period of time, and cumulatively that could have an impact in terms of the overall developer contributions that we get, and so there might be a situation where we might need to sort of dip into the in perpetuity fund to help cover those core costs. And what this report is seeking to do, or this part of the report is seeking to do, is to get permission that we should do that. In that situation, we would actually bring a report into joint committee to seek your approval for that. And what we'd also make sure is that at the earliest available opportunity, we would pay back the funding into the in perpetuity fund, because that has to cover the long-term mitigation that's required for the new development that's taking place, and that any interest that's required as well. What we're seeking in the report is agreement that we can follow that approach, but also that because Fareham Borough Council as the accountable body would be responsible for making sure that the fund was recompensed for the loss, we're also then seeking an agreement from all the other authorities that they would help underwrite that cost through an indemnity for Fareham Borough Council. obviously the expectation would be that as developer contributions come back in, that would be the mechanism for funding, putting the money back into the fund. But in the situation where there's ongoing lack of developer contributions coming in, obviously we'd try and cut the core costs of bird aware because we'd be over mitigating. But also that, there's a sort of like a fallback position that the individual authority would then need to provide that indemnity. So that's the sort of the part A of the report. Part B, which is the information items.
Sorry,
yeah.
Part A first,
okay, thank you.
For decision, and I think from what you're saying on that matter, there is an in perpetuity fund which could be used if necessary, and bird aware would cut its cloth as well and its activity accordingly. But it's as an absolute fallback position that the accountable body, in this case being Fareham Borough Council, would be indemnified by colleague authorities. But it looks as if there are various dominoes would need to fall long before that would actually happen, which would be the in perpetuity fund is significant, and of course activity would reduce if there was less funding there to support it. So if we can look then first at the items which are for decision, which is the noting and endorsing the Recreation Mitigation Partnership's proposed financial protocol in Part A of the report, and then B, noting and endorsing the issue around the indemnity there as well. So if anyone's got any issues there, I've seen, let's just have a look what we've got in terms of hands so far. So I've got Edward Heron from New Forest and then Michael Wilson from Havant. So Edward first, please.
Chairman, can I just for clarification from my own mind on the indemnity to the accountable body, I'm assuming that this would be limited to those funds that have been taken out of the in perpetuity fund to make good, and it wouldn't be an overall indemnity to the fact that the perpetuity fund could not continue effectively in perpetuity. I want to understand whether they're
absolutely. It's for the absolutely, Councillor Heron. It's about the money that's been taken out to make sure that goes back in with any relevant interest that's required for that.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you.
You're on mute, Chairman.
He's listening to Edward. Yes, Michael Wilson next from Havant, then, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Sort of variations on the theme, really. I wonder whether sort of if this is intended, this comes from future receipts from developers, then presumably there's a thought that we'd be putting up contributions from developers to cover the losses and the interest that we'd have to pay back. Is that how it's envisaged?
Paddy, you chair the.
Yeah, I mean certainly there would be an ongoing. There'd be an ongoing need to review the, as part of the strategy, the costs, and absolutely that could be part of that. That could be done to enable that to happen. Absolutely, but obviously that would also have to be approved by Push Joint Committee.
Okay, thank you for that point. So those recommendations then, I take it if there's no dissent that we give those assent as far as Part A items are concerned. And now we'll move on to Part B items. Is there anything you need to add on those, Paddy?
No, so Part B is just items for information. A number of the items there we've covered on the agenda today. We've attached the bird aware KPIs, which is a request from Joint Committee that we provide those to you on for each meeting. And there's also an update on the culture, creative industries aspect of Push's work. Particularly notable that creative growth is now available for the whole of South Hampshire. That Push contributed £10,000 towards the Portsmouth Creates project, and that finally Creative Network South are working with the Solent Growth Hub to signpost flexible workspaces for enterprises in the culture creative industry sector.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions or comments on any of that? Okay, then that's requested that we note that. Is there anyone who doesn't want to note it? I don't. Okay, that's done. I must just step backwards as well with apologies to the previous item we had. Excuse me. I did pass over the fact that there are recommendations there that we needed to agree, which was preparing the green print for South Hampshire, developing the draft framework, and working with leaders across sectors to develop a common approach and reviewing key plans. So I just need to ask that those are in fact agreed. So if anybody does not agree, please say so now. Okay, all right, sorry about that. Now move on the agenda, and the next item is item 8, which is the statement of common ground. And we have with us for item 8, we have Mike Orgrove and Claire Upton-Brown. So if you'd like to, whichever one of you is going to present this report, would like to present it, please.
Right, I'll be presenting the report, Chair. So the Joint Committee agreed the draft framework statement of common ground at its meeting in October 2019. And since that time, there has been good progress made. We've appointed Stantec and ITP to update the potential strategic development opportunity areas, and have also now appointed Stantec, who've commenced work on the economic, employment and commercial needs study. Progress has, however, been affected by working restrictions resulting from COVID-19. And as a result of this, the Planning Officers Group have reviewed the timetable and also reviewed the information and evidence that was set out in the initial draft. And it's concluded that at this stage, it's not essential to undertake work on the urban capacity assessment or the housing market area housing product delivery report. As a result of the discussions, there is a revision and update to the Statement of Common Ground, which is appended to the report. The main changes to the draft framework Statement of Common Ground are the removal of the urban capacity assessment and housing report, update and inclusion of the timetable of the evidence-based work stream within the Statement of Common Ground, changes to the base date from 2016 to 2020 for the reasons set out in this report, and also update the housing need and housing supply information to reflect the recently published affordability ratios and estimated supply from 2020 to 2036. And further, the inclusion following your earlier report of the reference to additional work stream that Push is considering to prepare a green print for South Hampshire. So if the recommendation is agreed by Joint Committee this evening, the next steps would be for each individual local planning authority and the County Council to sign up to the Statement of Common Ground and for this to be published on its website. Moving on to the second part of the paper relating to the Planning for the Future white paper, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. Appended in Appendix 2 to this report is a summary of the proposals contained in the white paper relating to strategic planning and consideration of a possible consultation response. Members are requested to provide a steer to whether Push-POG should respond to this consultation, and if so, what should be included in this response. Members may also wish to consider whether there are matters that aren't included in Appendix 1 that they may wish a response through Push to be made. Should members agree that to some of the questions being appropriate for a Push response, it is proposed that when the next POG meeting happens, there would be a discussion and agreement of the broad context of the response, reflecting any comments that may come out during debate this evening. So the recommendations are set out at the end of the report, and those are for the Joint Committee this evening to approve the content of the Statement of Common Ground attached as Appendix 1, to note the summary of the planning for the future white paper set out in Appendix 2 of the report, to determine whether Push should respond to the consultation, and if so, the nature of the response, and also to further agree that the details of any response delegated to myself as the chair of the Planning Officers Group, following consultation with the group and the chair of the Joint Committee. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Claire. So I think we need to probably take this then in two sections. One is the statement of common ground issue, and then secondly, the white paper issue. And of course, things are changing. You know, we have the consultation on the standard methodology for housing numbers. Of course, that closes tomorrow, and that's one very significant element. It's been picked up as far as possible within the statement of common ground report, but of course we have to be cognizant of the fact that various of us are at different stages in our local plan preparations and examinations. So those changes will have, you know, in some cases perhaps no effect because you're well through with your local plan, and for others they could have a very dramatic effect. So there's that issue. There's also, of course, the white paper, which will probably take a couple of years before that finds its way into law. And of course, we have the fact that some of us want the statement of common ground probably very, very quickly, and others don't need it at all, and others will have it when it's as we take time to bring it to fruition. So if we can concentrate perhaps first on that statement of common ground, and just see first whether anybody has any questions they would wish to ask or comments they would like to make. And if you do, please raise your hand. And the first one I've got is Neil Cutler from Winchester.
Thank you, Chairman. As a council, we're fully committed to the principle of working together across the wider region, but it becomes more complicated because only part of our district's in the Push region. We've had to pause our local plan since the government proposals and the new algorithm has increased our housing numbers hugely, and of course we also have the problem with the national park. So although we're completely committed to the idea of carbon neutral district, increasing biodiversity and protecting the identities of our towns and villages across the district, very much the principles articulated by Simon Eden earlier, but we have real concerns that the Green Belt proposal may be an old-fashioned and far too blunt an instrument to achieve those objectives. And at our council meeting last week, agreed to have a far more detailed look at the pros and cons of Greenbelt designation in the south of our district. So I really need to seek assurances that there'll be more further work on the Greenbelt aspect of the statement of common ground, so that we can review the impact and effectiveness and perhaps even likelihood of securing Greenbelt designation, because we have some problems with signing up to it at this stage with a full commitment to Greenbelt.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your comment and question there, Neil. I think the Greenbelt issue is one that I'll bring Claire in a moment, but I think it's got a huge amount of work left to do on that element. It's probably one of the biggest bits in it that's going to be nearest the end of the process, I would think, rather than where we are at the moment. I know that Bush authorities for some years now have all been absolutely signed up to the principle of investigating the production of a green belt in South Hampshire, and all of the ramifications around that are being looked at the moment. And of course, in terms of how that might fit with the white paper and what that might do in terms of how planning might change and how areas can be protected as well. I think lots and lots of people, of course, have the assumption that Hampshire's full of green belt, and you mustn't ever build on the green belt, and not generally realising that Hampshire actually is devoid of green belt, apart from a small area that I'm sure New Forest members would remind me of near New Milton, but that's it. There isn't anything else in the county of Hampshire. So it's certainly something we've had unanimity on to date, which is that we want to investigate the pros and cons of green belt, and that if that looks a good way to move, then that's what we want to do, because some of us don't have national park status within our areas. the best we can do in Fareham is our strategic gaps, which we want to keep. But as I always remind people, they have no status in planning terms. It's just a signal that the council thinks the area is special, but it doesn't grant it more protection than any other countryside designation. So that's why certainly in Fareham we're really keen on that concept. But Claire, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I think you put it very succinctly and given the Joint Committee and the member of the assurance that I would have given them.
Okay, thank you. So hopefully that's useful to you, Neil. Judith Grajewski next from Hampshire.
Thank you, Chairman. A couple of comments and a couple of questions on table 1. First of all, at paragraph 7 in the report, it says that the Planning Officer Group agreed it would not be appropriate to commission evidence on the need for affordable housing across the sub-region. It does seem a bit strange to me, because surely one of the reasons we need to build houses is because we need to build affordable housing. So perhaps there's a desperate need for affordable housing. So I'd be interested in other members' comments on that. At paragraph 14, yes, I'm pleased to see that the mention of supply of elderly persons accommodation is in there, not before time. Paragraph 20, it says that the final consultation response will have to go before the next meeting. I just wonder if it's possible for it to be circulated to all of the partnership members for approval by email rather than just delegate, because paragraph 23 does make provision in the event that there is not a consensus, but at least everybody then gets a look at it. Do you want me to carry on or deal with those first?
Let's knock a few of those out first, if we may, Judith. So on paragraph 7, talking about the housing market area, the housing delivery report, as it says, the evidence on the need for affordable housing work is done at local planning authority level, and we've always had a presumption within PUSH that the principle of subsidiarity will always apply. So we don't go in with our sort of size 10s into something that is already the domain of the individual local planning authority. So that work is already being done at local planning authority level, and we wouldn't want conflict that the differing evidence might provide. So that's the reason on that one. In terms of the white paper, I'll probably just leave that for a minute, because we're going to come to the white paper separately after we've dealt with the statement of common ground. And sorry, your other point was?
I was just welcoming paragraph 14 on elderly persons accommodation. Can I move on to the table, please? And I've got to ask why the review of evidence for the Greenbelt designation is being left until last on the timetable. As you know, I'm quite keen that we get on with this work, and we seem to have delayed it, and well, maybe not delayed, but not perhaps been as proactive as we might have been on this. If we're serious about it, then in my view it should be earlier in the process. And I also wonder if Q3 2020, i.e. now, is the right time to be looking at economic, employment and commercial needs, given the uncertain times that we're in. A lot could change in the next 6 months.
I'll move to Claire or Mike if you want to comment on the latter point.
So if I take the Greenbelt question first, I mean, we have debated at some length the appropriate time to bring in the Greenbelt, and as planning officers, we feel that the appropriate time to bring in that important piece of work is as we've set out. In terms of the economic piece, again, it will come as no surprise to you that we had exactly the same debate of, is this the right time to be doing that piece of work? And indeed, we had quite a long debate with the consultants about how we deal with that piece of work, given some of the uncertainties. And this is a strategic piece of work, so if at any point of time we chose to do that work, given the time span it stretches over, there's likely to be a downturn in the economy at some time during the period that work covers. So we have debated debated that, and we feel that it is appropriate to continue with that piece of work, accepting that the future and the immediate future does have some significant unknowns. We also, which the Joint Committee might like to know, had a debate around the Freeport discussion that's going on and whether that played a role in the work at the present time. That isn't included in the current work.
Could I just come back to you? I mean, I appreciate there's never a time when nothing moves, if I can put it that way, in terms of the economy. But can I ask why the planners have felt that the designation of green belt, or even moving on with that work, should be left until the end?
Again, some of the earlier work streams will help inform our discussion around Greenbelt. So it's for that reason that it's felt that the earlier work streams would help inform some of the discussion around Greenbelt.
Yeah, I asked the question because, of course, we've been talking about Greenbelt for such a long time now, and nothing seems to have moved forward on it. Sorry, I just do feel quite strongly about it. Thank you.
So a number of us do feel very strongly about the green belt issue. You know, I put it in years ago when we were talking about possible devolution in the area and said that it was important that we found a way of designating green infrastructure as well as all the other infrastructure, and the green belt was the way to do it. But so you can see there are divisions, you know, colleagues from Winchester with some doubts about it, but we absolutely mustn't lose sight of it, is my view, and we need to make sure that it is covered rather than not covered, and it absolutely will be covered.
Thank you. I agree, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. And move on now to Councillor Steve Philpott from Gosport.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Touching on points really that Judith just raised a moment ago, and that is the just provided we're satisfied, and I wanted to find out from Claire, is she's satisfied that we have sufficient agility and flexibility within this this statement of common ground document, because if one was to look at, say, just for an example, at paragraph 313, there's the focus there on promoting public transport of greater development in terms of employment and living in cities and towns. Now, I suppose really it's quite clearly obvious that we've got a major change seems to be underway in social habits and social behaviours, and it's accelerated enormously over the last 6 months with the pandemic. And what appears to be happening, and I think it's fairly clear now, is that we have a greater propensity for people to work from home, and businesses wanting that to happen as well. That in itself could have a knock-on impact in our town and particularly city centres in terms of office space and what's going to happen to that office space. And also we've got a wariness, let's say, from the residents and from people using public transport, for instance. There's also, over the last 6 months, those of us who've been fortunate enough to have gardens have had a pretty reasonable experience, I guess, if one could say, as far as the lockdown was concerned. But I imagine that experience has been significantly less palatable for people living in tower blocks and so on in our city centres. So what I'm getting at here is that there's a major social change underway with impacts that are inevitably going to be on our retail, town and city centres and so on, and whether or not we've got the sufficient amount of flexibility and agility within the document to cope with those changes.
And thank you for that point, Steve. And Ivor, want to give an answer?
Yeah, again, if I can come in, yes, we totally acknowledge that we are working in a very rapidly changing environment, and as planners, we see that as maybe making planning place even more important. So just to again give Councillor Philpott the confidence that we are aware of those rapid changes that could occur. We are discussing those with the consultants, and we will keep those under review to ensure that we are capturing any significant changes in the environment that we feel would need to be captured in this evidence-based to support local plans.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that, Claire. I'm not seeing any other questions on this element or comments on it. So in terms of the, we'll deal with these recommendations as we go. So being asked as recommendation A to approve the content of the Statement of Common Ground attached to Appendix 1 that will lead to the reduction of the push joint strategy. So seeing any, show if you've got a problem with that. I'm not seeing anyone, so take that one as agreed. Now we move on to the white paper matters, and there are a few recommendations to do with this, and one or two comments that have been made already as well. I think that as we are very much the partnership of the willing, I suspect that our response, if we agree to do one, isn't going to be all-encompassing, because there will be nuances which individual local planning authorities will put into their responses. I know in Fareham we've got a number of issues personal to us that we'll be making, and I'm sure that would be the case for colleagues as well. But there may be some principles which we can all agree upon, and the process for doing that is to utilise our planning officers group, which makes sure that every local authority is represented there. And then that would be dealt with. I'd see the final response as well. But of course, as long as you make sure that your planning officers consult you as leaders or senior representatives in your own councils, then you will be party to that letter as it moves forward. I think one thing certainly I think that is critically important is we have had now a 17-year relationship, which is a long time in anything actually, politics aside. So to achieve that, I think our duty to cooperate, I think the loss of the duty to cooperate, I think would be rather regrettable if that found its way into the white paper. It's a powerful tool that we can use, and it's what we've been all about for most of those 17 years. So I don't know what colleagues think, but certainly I think that is something that perhaps we could all unite around, the fact that we wouldn't wish to see that lost. But as I say, there will be other nuances, which is why I think it's important we let our professional officers work on it and consult us as leaders before it comes through for final sign-off. But see what other members think. And first is Councillor Keith House from Eastleigh.
Yes, thank you very much, Sean. And I mean, I agree with your commentary there. We have all been together such a long time. If anywhere in the country has demonstrated that the duty to cooperate can work, then actually it is South Hampshire. We don't always agree on absolutely everything, but we've managed to agree broad principles through that entire period. And that hasn't even been the lowest common denominator approach. We've tended to agree the vast majority of things, actually. And as you've said so often, we have rarely, if ever, needed to vote on anything because we've developed a consensus on things that matter most to South Hampshire. So I would hope that we would put in a response. I'd hope that we would certainly make the point about duty to cooperate. We can probably make quite a few responses that are pretty well common to local government. I think none of us are terribly keen on algorithms. I think government should have been proved by now that algorithms are always the most successful way of doing business. And certainly for planning allocations, they make no sense at all. We probably can't go as far as some of us have in saying that things like Surplan actually worked rather well in the past in terms of local authorities coming together and making a collective case within a figure that was agreed nationally for a region to deliver on housing requirements. But again, the broad principles that collaboratively we're better able to make a response than not is one that's worth signing up to. So I've every confidence that through the planning officers group we should be able to come up with something pretty substantial that most of us have total agreement to.
Thank you, Keith. That's really helpful, and I think like you, I spent a few years on the regional planning committee as well, although perhaps we don't actually share the love of that particular body, but never mind. Right, Councillor Stephen Philpott from Gosport.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I completely agree with you and with Keith too, of course. And I think it is important that the push is not silent on this matter. Something that Keith raised just a moment ago was not keen on algorithms. Absolutely right. I'm not keen on them either, and I think we need to have something to say about the standard methods, the standard methodology that's being proposed. And the standard methodology is primarily, although not entirely, a matter for the other document, if you like. There's two documents here, is there not? The other document, which is the changes to the current planning system document. Where the problem might lie there is it's now the 30th of September, and we have until 11:45 p.m. tomorrow evening to respond to the consultation on the document changes to the current planning system. So we don't have very long to get our comments in about the algorithm, if we have anything to say about that. The issue relating to other matters in the white paper, which has a slightly longer period for us to contemplate our standing, which is the 29th of October. That covers a whole variety of things, and I imagine some that members may be comfortable with, others that some members are going to be extremely uncomfortable with, and it's finding that common statement. I would suggest, if I was going to say my piece on it, Chairman, is that there's probably, if I could say, three central themes to the white paper. I mean, one is the zonal planning proposals, and whether or not we like the idea of having zonal planning to divide our areas, districts into three areas for zones. The second one is the theme which runs through everything, and I have to say strikes me as the centralisation of decision making, and that I'm afraid I don't consider to be a welcome development from the white paper. And the third one is the very significant proposed changes in the manner in which consultation will take place. And I would say that it's regrettable that the white paper is implying that the consultation needs to take place from the public at the beginning of the planning process when developing a local plan, and that there's appears to be precious little opportunity for public involvement at the later stage. How many of those major themes are actually ones that are relevant entirely to us as an organisation of push? I'd be interested to hear what other members might have to say about it. But I would certainly like us to have something to say. First off, I agree with you on the issue of cross-boundary issues and the duty to cooperate. But I would like also, I think, for us to have something to say about algorithms in general and the standard methodology that's being proposed in particular, which I think some members may share my discomfort, but I'd be interested to hear any views.
Thank you very much for that, Steve. I wasn't going to propose that we tried to get a response in the next, whatever it is, 28 hours on the first part of the consultation, because I suspect we might have some very different views, because personally I'm not an algorithm fan, but I must say I rather like this algorithm because of the effect that it's had in the borough which I lead. So I wasn't going to suggest we went down that route, and there really isn't the time to do it anyway. But I think in terms of the white paper, it is right, as Steve says. Hopefully, and as also Keith said, perhaps we'll get quite a lot of responses where we share common ground and would see them go through. I'm not seeing anybody else signifying they wish to speak on this item. So if they don't, then I will turn to the recommendations. And the ones which are remaining are that we note the summary on the Planning for the Future white paper, and we're going to determine that PUSH should respond to the consultation, and also that the detail of that is delegated to the planning officers group, and please all engage with your planning officers to make sure that the statement that comes back is one that you are comfortable with, and then it doesn't need to obviously keep going round and round, and we lose the sense of it over a period. Judith, you had a point.
Yes, thank you. I did ask earlier if it would be possible to circulate the response, as there is provision for approval to be given, or if there's not a full 100% consensus.
Well, it certainly is being circulated. It's going into every council with the planning officers group. So I guess maybe a good thing would be if you kind of dip into that process.
Okay, fine, thank you.
Because what might not have us then to circulate again to a dozen people after that, when the way these things normally work is it's probably going to be quite tight up against the deadline by the time that group has opined and consulted their own politicians on the matter. But I will certainly undertake that it will get to all members of Push as well, you know, once it's been completed and agreed. So we'll go to everybody. Committee
Thank you.
Clerk, please note that it goes to everybody. Okay, so asking that those recommendations are now agreed. If anybody wishes to signify to the contrary, I see none. So we'll now move to the final item on the agenda this evening, which is the Push Nutrient Neutrality Update. And we have David Bibby with us for this one. I did mention how things had moved on somewhat even today in terms of the legal agreements being signed with the Wildlife Trust, Fareham and the Isle of Wight Council. We have also got with us this evening Alison Potts from Natural England, in case there are any issues there that we might need to cover. But anyway, I'll hand over first, David, to you to see if there's anything you want to add to your report.
Thank you, Chairman. This is a further update on progress since the last Joint Committee meeting on the 7th of July. I think there's a number of issues raised in the report, but there's two key ones. The first one is government funding, and the second one is the recruitment of the temporary officer post. So if I may, I'll summarise the key points on those two items, including a verbal update and further additional detail as appropriate, following on from the time of the writing of the report. As you say, you know, things have developed and moved ahead. So firstly, there is the 2 million funding from the Getting Building Fund in the form of a loan directed by government through the Solent LEP. Discussions are continuing over the administration of this funding, and it is subject to quality assurance and a formal decision of the LEP board, and also its formal release by government and any further requirements that will need to be complied with by government, for example, on consultation. The LEP are proposing to contract directly with the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, and a business case for how this would operate is currently being worked up. It's anticipated that the funding will be used to purchase mitigation land on the Isle of Wight, and it will be delivered using the legal agreement mechanism which you mentioned, established between Fareham, the Isle of Wight and the Wildlife Trust. And it's understood that a similar arrangement would need to be in place for other authorities to similarly participate. The loan would be repaid by developers buying the mitigation credits through the scheme. The partnership PFSH will work with the Wildlife Trust in determining which developments are prioritised. The benefits of the mitigation land purchase can be used for development sites, which will be of benefit in supporting the Solent economy. It's unlikely, though, that the money can be recycled for a second phase, and therefore any future phases would be dependent upon the setting up of a Solent Nutria Fund, which we've considered at previous Joint Committee meetings, or further money from DEFRA. And then secondly, there's some further money from DEFRA of £3.9 million towards a pilot online nitrate trading platform for Hampshire. And this is proposed to test a new market-based approach to securing nature-based mitigation solutions, and it will be used to test the feasibility and costs of using a reverse auction approach and explore how multiple benefits for people and nature can be maximised. From the government's perspective, the intention is that if it was successful, this could then be rolled out across the country to other areas facing similar challenges. Although the funding's been announced in principle, we're still at a very early stage and further details are awaited. And it is proposed that PFSH will fully engage with government in developing how it's taken forward. And I think the government's made a commitment that they would do that. As the focus is on nature-based solutions, there's also the opportunity to link to wider strategy and other environmental priorities, including biodiversity enhancement, improved access to nature, reducing flood risk, and carbon sequestration. So that does fit very well with the item 6 we discussed previously on the agenda. And this also has slightly more flexibility, so we should hopefully be able to operate on a potentially wider geographical basis than the getting building funding. So it's a bit more, there's more flexibility of how that can be benefited, obviously, of the scale as well. DEFRA are also additionally exploring opportunities for a strategy to address nitrate pollution from farming through things like catchment sensitive farming, the future environmental land management scheme, and how they regulate chemicals through the agricultural industry. Both sources of funding are a welcome and positive development resulting from our partnership working and our engagement with government agencies and ministers. But as I've mentioned, there's still a number of details to be finalised, and further mitigation will still be needed additionally in giving us a sort of comprehensive solution going forward sufficiently at scale. And then on the temporary officer posts, all member authorities signed up to provide funding towards the post, together with Basingstoke-and-Deane, Chichester and the South Downs National Park, who are also represented on the Water Quality Working Group. The post is proposed to be a 12-month temporary officer, which has been titled or pitched as a strategic environmental planning officer. It will be at principal officer level and will be hosted by Fareham. It's also a potential secondment opportunity from an officer from one of the authorities. The role of the officer will be to take forward a pilot sub-regional mitigation scheme in working towards a solent nutrient fund, and the previous July report gave more details of the duties of the role. The post has now been advertised and the closing date was last Friday. So at the moment, interviews are potentially anticipated for mid-October. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that, David. That was really helpful. Now, I did mention at the beginning that we do have Alison Potts with us as well from Natural England. I don't know, Alison, whether you'd like to add anything in general terms or indeed in terms of the item to do with the new funding, the new DEFRA funding, and how that might work and how close we might be there. But over to you for anything you'd like to say.
Yes, happy to, and thank you for having me. I think we're really pleased that we're at this stage where the funding's been announced. It's been frustrating for us to be having conversations behind closed doors with DEFRA, not be able to discuss that openly with you at an early stage. But rest assured, through our involvement in the Water Quality Working Group, we've been looking to make sure that the objectives of the various schemes will be closely aligned. And we're looking forward to the next stage in the projects and beginning to work closely with your new principal officer. So I think there's two elements to the potential funding. One is about bringing forward those nature-based solutions on a strategic scale. So as David mentioned, it would go beyond the Solent LEP area to deal with the whole area affected, we hope. Discussions there are still at an early stage, and so it's difficult to say what will come of that, but potentially that has the ability to clear the backlog, as it were, and then some. And the Wildlife Trust is confident that it has sites in the pipeline that could unlock housing across the affected area. So that's great news in the short term. I think the nitrate trading platform, the idea there is that in the medium to long term, if it's successful, we would be looking at an ability to provide mitigation without having to purchase the land. So it could actually make a big difference in terms of what might be needed for a nitrate fund. So it really is about trying to link those land managers with developers and to do so in a competitive fashion to keep those costs down as much as possible. I think that's probably all there is to say at the moment. It's obviously a scheme that's being worked up, and we're looking forward to engaging on those discussions going forward.
Thank you very much for that, Alison. Obviously, I can't resist having Environment Agency on the meeting as well, and see whether Charlotte has anything you might like to add, and whether indeed there's any update on water quality permits and what's actually happening there, because despite all the letters that I've sent, ministers really haven't been terribly engaging over any of this. Now, obviously, I see positivity in terms of DEFRA funding coming through and the other things that we're managing, but it's very much homegrown at the moment. I just wonder what's happening in that in more sort of general fashion with your work and the tensions of maybe the past, maybe still the present between Natural England and the EA.
So, as you will be aware, some of our work paused because of COVID, but we're starting to pick things back up again. And there is a meeting in November of our directors that will be discussing the Dutch ruling and the permits. So I'll be able to hopefully be able to give you some further updates at the next committee, if not before.
And that's brilliant, thank you. I don't feel you need to wait for a committee date. So
no, I won't.
Write to me and I'll circulate it to all the participants. Thank you. Right, one hand up at the moment, Alison Barnes from New Forest National Park.
Thank you, Chairman. I just really need to ask Alison a bit more about the policy driver behind the trading fund. You know, I appreciate that obviously it was, for some reason, which maybe you could explain to us, had to be, you know, developed, you know, behind closed doors, your word. But, you know, where is this coming from in terms of government policy? How are we, you know, being looked upon to kind of blaze the trail? What do we need to do to kind of feed into that? And I ask that as one of the deaf responsive bodies, actually. And as we got Charlotte, I've also become aware of another fund, which I believe closed today, which is called Investment Readiness Fund, which is an EA fund, which relates to this kind of work as well. So I'm just wondering, how could we, you know, can we get better at sort of understanding the policy drivers and joining them up locally so that we can take advantage of this together?
Other Alison.
Good question. I think the policy drivers for DEFRA in this case are very much about understanding how what the options are for delivering the 25-year environment plan going forward. Environmental net gain, nature-based solutions all feature in that, and I think they see helping to pump prime the mitigation options in the Solent as an opportunity to test the deliverability and to measure the effectiveness of some of those nature-based solutions. And by doing so, to learn lessons that help make sure that these things will be deliverable faster, more effectively, and in particular, looking at that opportunity to layer additional environmental benefits so that rather than just dealing with nitrates, we are genuinely able to capitalise on all the benefits for people and wildlife.
Okay, thank you. I've got Nick Adams, Councillor Nick Adams-King now. Test Valley. Nick.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Can I just check something that Alison just said, which is that although the allocation of funding from the Getting Building Fund is coming through the Solent LEP, for those of us that aren't part of the Solent LEP, since we had to choose between which LEP we joined as a whole authority, that the whatever is brought forward by the Wildlife Trust is open to those of us that are affected by this, although we're not part of the LEP, despite the fact that the Solent LEP has been granted the money. If that makes sense, please.
Okay, Alison, sounds like it might be that larger DEFRA fund that's for all of Hampshire, isn't it, rather than the...
Yes, there's two potential sources of loan funding, the DEFRA loan, which is for the whole affected area, and the LEP funding, which, although it's not restricted to the LEP boundaries, exclusively can only be spent where there is a benefit to the Solent LEP economy. So there's some flexibility there, but it obviously doesn't cover the whole affected area, which is why working to secure that DEFRA funding is really important.
Do you mind if I just come back about that? So that therefore might mean that if we were to look at areas within the old push boundary, the one that existed before the one that was coterminous with the old LEP boundary, that's probably the best way to look at it for all of us.
I think that would make a great deal of sense because, of course, we all accepted in the formative days of the LEP 9 years ago that was the natural economic area. You know, despite what happened then and the government insisting on using district boundaries and unitary boundaries as building blocks, you know, we accepted that. So I guess if you're doing something there, then there couldn't be too much argument that it was to the economic benefit of the Solent LEP area. Brian, very opportune, would you like to comment? Brian Johnson.
Thank you, Sean. I was just going to comment that would certainly be our intention. I mean, as you know, the way LEPs are set up is that we can only spend money in our area and the boundaries exist, but that the key point is the economy of the area. And as we've all discussed, I think at this and several other meetings, economies don't just stop on a line on a map. So I think it would be the board's intention to enact this fund in a sensible way for the wider region. So I can't answer specific cases that reassure the councillor, but I'm sure the board's intention would be to operate this in the best way for the region.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. That's helpful. Right, I'm not seeing any other hands waving, so I'll just turn to the recommendations, which are both for noting, and that's noting Bush's bid as a listed project, £2 million loan from the government's Getting Building Fund, and noting the recruitment of a dedicated officer resource for nutrient neutrality, working towards a Solent nutrient fund. So I'll take it, if I see nothing contrary, that those recommendations are both agreed. So that, my agenda, brings me to the end of the meeting. So I thank you very much for your attendance and participation this evening, and hope you all have a good evening. So thank you very much indeed, and good night.